In the autumn of 1965, the Higgins family, 2 parents, 2 children, vanished without a trace from their stone cottage in the quiet village of Ashworth, Yorkshire. At first, their disappearance was filed away as just another unsolved mystery gathering dust in the local constabulary's archives. But everything changed 3 months later. Beneath the cold floorboards of St. Mary's Church, investigators uncovered a hidden room, its air still untouched by time. Inside were the personal belongings of the Higgins family, laid out as if waiting for their return. Along with handwritten journals describing forbidden rites the Church of England had officially outlawed centuries ago. The most disturbing part, the final journal entry, was dated 2 weeks after the family had reportedly vanished. For nearly 60 years, the church has refused to comment on what was found in that hidden chamber. The Higgins cottage still stands abandoned and untouched, a ghost on the edge of the village. But in 1985, when sealed church records were finally accessed by investigators, a chilling truth came to light. The Higgins family weren't the first to disappear under such circumstances. Tonight, I'm going to share what really happened in that forgotten Yorkshire village, drawn from documents that have never been made public until now, including the words of the only surviving witness, someone who's kept a vow of silence for 40 years and who has now decided to tell the truth. But before we descend into the shadows surrounding St. Mary's Church and the mystery of the Higgins family, understand this. This channel is not for everyone. It's for those rare souls who dare to face the secrets others are too afraid to uncover. If you're one of them, hit subscribe now and let me know in the comments what country you're listening from. Because here at Sleepy History Tales, we tell the stories they tried to bury. The stories hidden beneath centuries of silence. Now let's step into the mist of 1965 Yorkshire and uncover the terror that crept through Ashworth village. What unfolded there would shake the foundation of everything the townspeople believed about their quiet, God-fearing home, and reveal a conspiracy of silence that protected horrors long thought dead and buried. For half a century, Ashworth remained untouched by time, the kind of village where the centuries folded in on themselves like layers of old parchment. Time moved differently there, slower, older. The ancient stone cottages whispered with the memories of 800 years of human life. Tucked deep within the Yorkshire dales, ringed by moors and hills that blushed purple with heather. Each autumn, Ashworth was home to barely 300 souls. Nearly all of them could trace their family lines back 5 or 6 generations, living in the same handful of cottages as their ancestors. At the heart of the village stood St. Mary's Church, a breathtaking Norman relic whose weathered limestone tower soared nearly 100 feet into the brooding Yorkshire sky. Built in 1187 atop the ruins of an older Saxon chapel, the church had long been wrapped in folklore. Whispers passed down through generations claimed that the land itself had been considered sacred long before Christianity reached these hills. The oak doors, immense iron-banded and blackened by time, groaned on their hinges in the wind that rolled endlessly down from the moors. But something changed in the autumn of 1965. A strange, penetrating chill settled over the village, colder than anyone remembered. The trees turned early that year, their leaves erupting in shades of crimson and gold that felt almost too vivid, too unnatural. As twilight fell, a thick fog began to seep into the valley, like a living presence coiling around the gravestones of St. Mary's and clinging to its cold stone walls. The mist became so dense that long-time residents reported losing their bearings entirely when walking through the churchyard at dusk. Paths they'd known all their lives seemed to shift, as if the village itself had forgotten its shape. Even the church bells were not immune to the change. For centuries, they had rung with punctual clarity, calling the faithful to worship, marking time with steady grace. But that autumn, their sound deepened. Mrs. Agnes Peaton, who had lived beside the church for over 6 decades, noticed it first. The bells no longer rang clean and sharp. Instead, they resonated with a strange heaviness, as though the very air had thickened. Late at night, Agnes sometimes swore she heard the bells tolling, when they shouldn't be soft, sorrowful echoes that seemed to rise from beneath the earth, not above it. Thomas Arthur Higgins was not a man who believed in superstition. He lived his life by routine clockwork precision, passed down from father to son. At 38, he had inherited both his father's position at the village post office and his quiet, methodical nature. Each morning at exactly 7 Sautre, Thomas would step out of his cottage on Church Lane, dressed in his carefully pressed suit, his worn leather satchel in hand. He walked his 2 children, Margaret Rose 12 and young William Thomas 8, to the village school, then continued to the post office to sort letters and manage telegrams for the entire valley. A reserved man, Thomas kept to himself, but those who knew him described him as deeply rooted in his faith, pious in the quiet, practical way of the Yorkshire countryside. He was a church warden at St. Mary's and could be found every Sunday arranging the hymnals, polishing the collection plates, and preparing for worship with steadfast dedication. His belief was as solid and immovable as the hills surrounding the village, reliable, unshaken, which made what happened to him all the more impossible to comprehend. Elaena Mary Higgins, née Whitlock, had arrived in Ashworth 15 years earlier as a young bride. At 35, she still possessed the quiet beauty that had first caught Thomas's eye at a church social in nearby halls. Her dark hair, always pinned in a sensible style befitting a village mother, still shimmered when it caught the sunlight, giving her a look of youth that defied the years. Like her husband, Elaena ran their cottage with structured precision. But unlike Thomas, there was a subtle restlessness in her, an inward pull towards something more, something older. She had always been drawn to local history and folklore, spending long afternoons in the village library, poring over books about the ancient customs of the Dales. Her garden was a quiet rebellion, a tangle of herbs and wildflowers that the older villagers recognized from their childhoods. Plants their grandmothers had once cultivated for purposes long since banished from polite conversation. When asked about her botanical choices, Elaena would simply smile and say she liked preserving old traditions, though she never explained which traditions she meant. The Higgins children were the pride of Ashworth's small schoolhouse. Margaret Rose, the elder at 12, was a serious, introspective girl who excelled in her studies and helped her mother with the household without ever needing to be asked. She had inherited her mother's dark hair and her father's quiet steadiness, but her teachers often remarked on something else, an uncanny maturity, a gravity that made her seem older than her years. It was as though she carried some ancient knowledge, one that weighed silently on her young shoulders. Margaret loved to read particularly books on history and mythology. She could often be found sitting among the moss-covered gravestones of St. Mary's, carefully copying the weather-worn inscriptions from the oldest headstones into a little notebook she always kept close. Her younger brother, William Thomas, though everyone called him Billy, was the village's undisputed charmer. At just 8 years old, he had a laugh that could light up even the gloomiest Yorkshire morning. Curious about everything, Billy was especially fascinated by the church. He spent countless hours tracing the outlines of the carved stone gargoyles on its exterior, asking endless questions about the meanings hidden in the stained glass windows. Billy had a habit of drawing constantly. He filled notebook after notebook with sketches of the church, the winding paths through the fields, the towering hills around Ashworth. But as the autumn deepened, something began to change in his drawings. They grew darker, stranger images that disturbed his teacher in ways she couldn't quite explain. Ashworth itself moved according to rhythms long established, centuries-old patterns that few ever questioned. Market day still took place each Thursday in the stone-paved square beside the church, though now the vendors arrived in cars instead of carts. The Shepherd's Rest pub served as the unofficial town hall where gossip flowed more freely than the ale. The post office, managed by Thomas Higgins, doubled as the general store. The schoolhouse taught children from ages 5 to 14, after which they were sent to the nearby town of Horses for further schooling. But beneath the placid surface of this picturesque village, secrets had long taken root, secrets older than the church tower itself. Ashworth had always been an insular place, not just in terms of geography, but culture. The old families, the Whitlocks, the Carrs, the Thorntons, and a few others had intermarried for generations, guarding ancient traditions that outsiders seldom glimpsed. These bloodlines were bound not only by ancestry, but by knowledge carefully guarded, passed down in whispers and rituals. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the village librarian and unofficial chronicler of Ashworth's past, belonged to one such family. Her ivy-covered cottage contained shelves of rare manuscripts, some of which dated back centuries, texts the church had attempted to suppress during waves of religious reform. At 70-something, Mrs. Thornton was a small, sharp-eyed woman with a voice like a whispering wind. She never married, dedicating her life instead to what she called preserving our heritage. And she seemed to know what was happening in the village before anyone else did. Dr. Edmund Carr, the village physician, was another from the old bloodlines. At 55, he had returned to Ashworth after completing his medical training in Edinburgh. He brought with him modern knowledge, but blended it with something far older. His grandmother, a renowned herbalist, had taught him methods not found in any medical text. Dr. Carr kept detailed records, not just of his patients' physical health, but what he referred to as their spiritual well-being, though he never quite explained what he meant by that. The village constable, Sergeant Robert Henley, was one of the few figures of authority not tied to the old families. He had been stationed in Ashworth 5 years prior and had quickly come to sense that certain aspects of village life remained forever just out of reach. A thorough and deliberate man, Henley prided himself on knowing every corner of his jurisdiction, but the walls of silence around Ashworth's oldest traditions had become a source of growing frustration. Then there was Reverend Harold Whitmore, For 23 years, he had served as vicar of St. Mary's, arriving in Ashworth as a fresh-faced curate straight out of theological college. But over the decades, something had changed. The energetic young reformer had become something else, something more secretive, more troubling. His study, located in the old rectory beside the church, had gradually filled with artifacts, ancient manuscripts, archaeological fragments, books on subjects far removed from Anglican orthodoxy. Visitors who stepped into that study often left unsettled, unable to shake the sense that Reverend Whitmore's faith had taken a path that no longer led toward light. Reverend Harold Whitmore was a tall, angular figure, his prematurely grey hair giving him a ghostly presence even in daylight. His eyes, cold and pale, had an unsettling way of looking through people rather than at them. Over the years, his sermons had grown increasingly obscure, dense with references to older truths and deeper mysteries that left many parishioners confused and uneasy. Yet, despite the strangeness of his messages, he remained quietly popular, especially among the old families who seemed to understand the hidden meanings in his words, when others could not. In the weeks leading up to the Higgins family's disappearance, several villagers began to notice subtle but growing changes in their behavior. At first, it was little things. Elaena lingering in the churchyard longer than usual, Thomas appearing distracted, anxious, his usual stoicism replaced by a quiet nervousness. The children, once bright and engaged, became distant, withdrawn. But as October wore on, these changes became too unsettling to ignore. Mrs. Agnes Petton, whose cottage shared a garden wall with the Higgins family, was the first to observe Elaena's increasingly strange behavior. Beginning in early October, she noticed the young mother spending hours in the St. Mary's churchyard after dark. Often she carried bundles of what appeared to be herbs, dried flowers, and other odd items that Mrs. Petton couldn't quite identify in the pale moonlight. When she finally gathered the courage to ask Elaena what she was doing, the younger woman gave her a gentle smile and replied, "I'm tending to old traditions, Mrs. Petton. Someone has to keep the proper observances." The phrase proper observances meant nothing to Mrs. Petton, but it left her with a lingering unease she couldn't shake. Elaena's voice had been calm, almost cheerful, but there was something in her eyes, a depth of knowing that disturbed the older woman, as if Elaena held secrets better left unspoken. From that night on, Mrs. Petton drew her curtains tight after sunset and avoided further conversations with her neighbor. Meanwhile, Mr. Arthur Finch, the owner of the village's general store, noticed unusual changes in Elaena's shopping habits. Normally frugal and precise, she had always purchased only what was needed, maintaining immaculate household accounts. But suddenly, she began buying in bulk pounds of coarse salt, dozens of white candles, and large quantities of specific herbs. These were obtained through old Mrs. Weatherby, the village's unofficial herbalist, who grew medicinal plants in the garden behind her cottage. When Mr. Finch asked about the strange supplies, Elaena simply said she was preparing for the harvest season. But the Higgins family had never grown more than a modest kitchen garden, and the items she bought, especially in such volume, seemed intended for some kind of ritual, not cooking. Still, Mr. Finch said nothing more. In Ashworth, it was often wiser not to ask too many questions. At the village school, Miss Sarah Collins, the children's teacher, had begun to grow concerned as well. Margaret, once her most attentive student, had become distracted and strangely vacant. She often gazed out the window during lessons, eyes fixed on the distant spire of St. Mary's. When called upon, she would respond slowly as though waking from a dream. Her essays, once meticulous and clear, had become filled with cryptic references to ancient wisdom, forgotten truths, and sacred rhythms older than scripture. But it was Billy's behavior that truly unsettled her. The cheerful, lively boy was now obsessed with drawing, spending every spare moment sketching the same disturbing image over and over. The picture showed robed figures gathered around an altar, its surface carved with strange symbols that Miss Collins didn't recognize, but that made her deeply uneasy. There was something in the drawing, something primitive and wrong, that made her skin crawl. When she gently asked Billy what it meant, he replied in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice, "It's the old church. Mommy and Mr. Whitmore taught me." Alarmed, Miss Collins scheduled a parent conference with Thomas Higgins in mid-October. She found him tired, tense, and visibly distressed. When she expressed her concerns, Thomas listened politely, but seemed evasive. He admitted finally that Elaena had become involved in what he called historical research with Reverend Whitmore and several others from the village. "It's just academic," he insisted. Nothing more. But even as he spoke, the words, Miss Collins could see something flickering behind his eyes, fear, and something like guilt still. Despite his calm words, it was clear from Thomas Higgins's manner that he was far from at ease with what had begun to unfold inside his own home. The group that would eventually be revealed as the center of Ashworth's darkest secrets began, at least outwardly, with innocent intentions. In 1962, Reverend Whitmore proposed forming a local society to study the historical traditions of the Yorkshire Dales, with a special focus on the pre-Christian customs that had shaped the region's culture long before the arrival of the church. At first, it appeared to be a purely academic endeavor. The founding members included Reverend Whitmore himself, Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the village librarian, Dr. Edmund Carr, the local physician, Mrs. Dorothy Weatherby, the well-known herbalist, and Mr. James Crawford, a retired schoolmaster who had recently moved to Ashworth from London. The group met monthly in the vestry of St. Mary's Church, discussing archaeological discoveries and historical documents related to ancient regional beliefs. They called themselves the Ashworth Historical Preservation Society, and they claimed to be working on a comprehensive book of local folklore, something to preserve the village's cultural heritage for future generations. Elaena Higgins joined the group in the spring of 1964. Her deep interest in local history, paired with her knowledge of traditional customs, made her a natural fit. Reverend Whitmore, who had quietly observed her library visits and her passion for folklore, personally invited her to participate. Elaena quickly became one of the society's most devoted contributors. Her knowledge of herbal medicine and seasonal celebrations impressed even the more senior members of the group. Her research was thorough, her observations insightful, and her enthusiasm infectious. But what the public never saw was how slowly the society's activities began to shift. By early 1963, The group had moved beyond books and began conducting what they referred to as practical demonstrations of the rituals they were studying. These were initially justified as harmless reenactments necessary for fully understanding the practices of the past. At first, it seemed benign enough. They held seasonal gatherings tied to agricultural festivals, practiced ancient methods of herbal preparation, and explored meditative techniques said to originate from Celtic spiritual traditions. But as time went on, these activities grew more intricate and increasingly troubling. Under Reverend Whitmore's guidance, the group began to adopt the belief that intellectual study was not enough. True understanding, he claimed, required experiential participation. To rediscover what had been lost, they had to live the rituals, not just analyze them. He argued that early Christian authorities had buried powerful spiritual knowledge that could only be recovered through sacred reenactment. According to him, this wasn't just historically valuable, it was spiritually essential. By the time Elaena became an active member, the group was meeting twice monthly. They also began holding special gatherings tied to what they referred to as significant dates on the ancient calendar times of celestial alignment, harvest transitions, and lunar cycles. These observances didn't take place in the vestry. Instead, they were held in a hidden chamber beneath St. Mary's Church, a space Reverend Whitmore claimed to have discovered during renovations. He insisted the room had been used for religious rites long before the Norman church was built. It was, he said, a sacred link to their ancestors and to something much older than Christianity. Elaena embraced the society's new direction with unshakable enthusiasm. She believed they were rediscovering spiritual truths that had been unjustly erased from history. It was she who first proposed that entire families participate in certain rituals, arguing that many ancient traditions were designed for family units, and that partial participation could result in unfinished rites with unknown and possibly dangerous consequences. At first, Thomas was skeptical. He had never been one for strange ideas, let alone ritual gatherings in candlelit basements. But Elaena seemed happier than she had been in years, energized, inspired. She returned from meetings with excitement in her voice, sharing stories of lost customs and Yorkshire legends so rich in detail that even Thomas found himself drawn in despite his doubts. When she suggested that he might enjoy attending one of the society's upcoming presentations, Thomas, perhaps against his better judgment, agreed. The meeting Thomas Higgins attended in June of 1964 seemed on the surface perfectly innocent. Reverend Whitmore delivered a lecture on medieval agricultural practices, complete with age documents and soil-worn farming implements borrowed from regional collections. The members of the Historical Preservation Society were knowledgeable and deeply invested in their research, and Thomas found himself genuinely intrigued. There was something oddly satisfying about learning how his ancestors might have once tended the land centuries ago. But as the months passed and Elaena became more deeply enmeshed in the society's inner workings, Thomas began to feel a growing unease. His wife, once grounded and practical, began to speak critically of modern religious practice. She suggested that contemporary Christianity had lost its way, that it had severed itself from a deeper, older spiritual truth, that ancient traditions still held. Her reading habits shifted. She stayed up through the night, poring over strange handwritten texts that Reverend Whitmore had given her, then rose before dawn to tend to plants and perform rituals in the garden, rituals that had no obvious purpose. Most unsettling of all was her growing insistence that their children be included in what she now referred to as education in the old ways. Margaret and Billy were taught about herbal medicine's seasonal observances and what Elaena called a proper reverence for the forces that shape the world. At first, the children seemed to enjoy the lessons, but Thomas noticed a subtle change in them, too, an inwardness. They began to share whispered jokes and secretive glances, making cryptic references to things Thomas didn't understand. It was as if they had entered a world he was no longer part of. By September 1965, Thomas could no longer ignore the growing divide in his household. He decided to confront Reverend Whitmore directly. He arranged a private meeting with the vicar in his study, determined to discuss his concerns about Elaena's deepening involvement with the society and the impact it was having on their family. But what he encountered in that conversation would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Whitmore's study had always been a cluttered space filled with papers and books, but now it was something else entirely. The walls were lined with shelves of ancient volumes in unfamiliar languages. The floor was crowded with ritual objects and strange artifacts, carved stones, ceremonial bowls, old bones wrapped in cloth. The air was thick with the scent of old incense and damp earth. The vicar welcomed Thomas with a calm smile, listening intently as he voiced his fears. He nodded, asked pointed questions, even showed empathy. But when Thomas finished, the tone of the meeting changed. Rather than offer reassurance or propose limits on Elaena's involvement, Reverend Whitmore spoke in a low, solemn voice about duties, about spiritual obligations that transcended personal feelings. He spoke of ancient responsibilities passed through generations, and of the danger, both spiritual and communal, of turning away from rituals that had kept Ashworth safe for centuries. What began as a polite conversation had transformed into something else. A veiled warning. Thomas left the rectory shaken. He couldn't quite explain why, but something in Whitmore's words had chilled him. The vicar had never explicitly threatened him, and yet the message was unmistakable. The Higgins family's involvement in the group wasn't just encouraged, it was expected, required. By October 1965, the pace of strange events in Ashworth had accelerated, almost as if something had shifted into motion. Elaena's activities grew more intense and secretive. She made frequent trips to the church, sometimes alone, sometimes with the children. She prepared mixtures of herbs and other materials that she refused to explain, even as Thomas's anxiety grew. The woman he had married was still there in voice and face, but she had stepped into another world, one he could no longer follow her into. As the final days of October crept forward, the Higgins children began exhibiting behaviors that unnerved even those closest to them. Both Margaret and Billy had developed a vocabulary and manner of speech that seemed far beyond their years, using words and concepts few children, even the most precocious, would have ever encountered. Dr. Edmund Carr Ashworth's physician and a founding member of the Historical Society would later testify that Thomas Higgins visited his surgery on 3 separate occasions that month. The symptoms, according to Dr. Carr, pointed to severe anxiety, what he described in his notes as acute nervous exhaustion. Thomas complained of unrelenting insomnia, a complete loss of appetite, and a constant gnawing sensation he could only describe as a feeling of doom, a weight that never left his chest. When Dr. Carr gently pressed him for more specific causes, Thomas spoke only in vague, fragmented phrases that Elaena had become involved in things that were not safe, that something old had been stirred awake, and that his family was now in danger. During his final visit on the afternoon of October 25th, Thomas appeared barely coherent. He spoke in a rapid, fevered cadence, his hands shaking, as he described ceremonies that couldn't be stopped once they'd begun. He asked Dr. Carr about religious mania, whether it could be treated, whether it was possible for someone to become so convinced they were receiving divine communication that they lost touch with reality. Then, after a long silence, Thomas asked something that sent a chill through the doctor's spine. Do you believe that old evil can remain in a place even centuries after the deed is done? When Dr. Carr asked what had prompted the question, Thomas explained in a hushed voice that Elaena had begun frequenting parts of the church that had never been open to the public before hidden rooms and passageways she claimed were revealed to her through guidance from beyond the veil of ordinary perception. Disturbed but unsure of how to help, Dr. Carr recommended that Thomas speak with Reverend Whitmore. Perhaps the vicar could provide spiritual counsel, or at least give Thomas some peace of mind. It was advice the physician would regret for the rest of his life. What Dr. Carr did not realize was that Reverend Whitmore was not a healer of souls in this matter. He was not a safe haven for the Higgins family. He was the architect of everything that would soon come to pass. The final week of October brought a visible transformation in the Higgins household, one that did not go unnoticed by their neighbors. Elaena withdrew completely from social life. She no longer visited the market or attended community events. Her only appearances outside the cottage were her increasingly frequent trips to St. Mary's Church. Margaret and Billy stopped playing with other children, remaining almost entirely indoors. When they were seen, they looked pale, fatigued, and oddly expressionless, like shadows of their former selves. Thomas, known for his punctuality and devotion to duty, missed several days of work at the post office, something that had never happened in 15 years of service. Mrs. Agnes Petton, ever observant from her neighboring window, reported hearing strange sounds coming from the Higgins cottage. In the late hours of the night, low rhythmic chanting, the crackling of substances burned in ritual, and voices murmuring with such emotional intensity that though she could not make out the words, the tone left her deeply unsettled. On more than one occasion, she saw cloaked visitors arriving at the cottage after nightfall. They came alone or in pairs, dressed in dark clothing, moving silently, purposefully, and never staying longer than an hour. She never saw their faces. Sunday, October 31st, 1965, dawned grey and bitterly cold. The autumn fog that had haunted Ashworth for weeks hung heavy in the air, so thick that the spire of St. Mary's was completely swallowed from view. The church bells rang as they always had, but the sound was dull, dampened, as if the mist itself were absorbing the resonance. The morning service proceeded as scheduled. The Higgins family sat in their usual pew, the third row center left. But something about them was different. Several parishioners later described the atmosphere as tense charged, though no one could quite explain why. Elaena, normally composed, and still sat with a look of laser-sharp focus, her gaze locked on Reverend Whitmore throughout the sermon. She clutched a small leather-bound journal, taking notes in it, something she had never done before. That morning's sermon was titled, "The Covenant Beyond Time." It centered on the idea of ancient pacts, sacred bonds made long ago, whose power still echoed through the bloodlines of those chosen to uphold them. Many in the congregation found the sermon strange, even disturbing. But for Elaena Higgins, it seemed to be confirmation. Thomas Higgins sat rigid in the pew beside his wife. His face was bloodless, his hands clenched tight in his lap. He didn't glance sideways once. The children, too, were unnervingly still, sitting in silence with perfect posture that seemed more trained than natural. Parishioners would later recall that there was something off about the family that morning, though few could say exactly what. Reverend Whitmore's sermon was also different. His usual lofty, abstract theological language had taken on a darker tone. He spoke of duties older than the church, of commitments that reached beyond personal belief, obligations passed down through bloodlines. He made several veiled references to tonight's observance and warned of the danger in leaving things incomplete once they have begun. Most of the congregation found his words cryptic, even confusing. But for certain listeners, they seemed to carry a hidden meaning. After the service, the Higgins family left quickly. They didn't linger to chat with neighbors or shake the vicar's hand at the door. Their walk home was brisk and silent, so unlike their usual Sunday stroll that it caught the attention of Mrs. Agnes Petton, who was tending her garden as they passed. She greeted them with her usual warmth, but none of them responded. Not even Billy, who normally couldn't resist waving to her. They simply continued down the lane, their steps fast, their faces blank. It was the last time the entire Higgins family would ever be seen in public. The final confirmed sighting came around 2:30 p.m. when Mr. Arthur Finch saw them enter their cottage and shut the door firmly behind them. What happened after that would not be known until much later, when investigators uncovered evidence hidden beneath St. Mary's Church. That evening, Mrs. Petton noticed that the lights in the Higgins cottage were extinguished earlier than usual. By 8:00 p.m., the house was completely dark. Normally, the family stayed up reading or preparing for the coming week, but this night, all was still. At 10:00, when she peeked through her curtains again, there was no flicker of lamplight, no movement inside. Just silence. Then, sometime after midnight, Mrs. Petton was startled awake by something she couldn't immediately identify. Distant sounds, melodic but unnatural. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The noise had the cadence of chanting, low rhythmic, rising and falling in waves like breath. As the sound grew clearer, she realized it was real. Moving to her bedroom window, she pulled back the curtain, and what she saw would remain etched in her memory for the rest of her life. In the fog-drenched churchyard of St. Mary's, robed figures moved slowly in a wide circle around the ancient stone walls. They held candles or torches that cast flickering light through the mist. Their garments were long and dark, their faces completely hidden. And yet their movements were practiced, synchronized. This was no spontaneous gathering. This was a ceremony. The chanting continued, ceaseless and haunting. It seemed to twist the very air around it. And then she heard something that turned her blood cold. Children's voices, high, clear notes woven into the deeper tones of the adult chorus. Not screams, not cries, but singing deliberate and chilling. It was wrong, though she couldn't explain why. And then they disappeared. Mrs. Petton watched in horror as the robed figures moved toward the church itself and vanished. They didn't scatter or leave through the gates. It was as if the very stone had opened to receive them, swallowing the procession whole. The torches flickered for hours afterward, but no one ever came out. When the fog lifted the next morning, Monday, November 1st, 1965, the village of Ashworth would awaken to one of the most unsettling mysteries in Yorkshire history. Thomas Higgins did not arrive at the post office by his usual time of 8:15 a.m. His supervisor, Mr. Gregory Walsh, initially thought nothing of it. Perhaps someone had fallen ill, or they'd gone out of town unexpectedly. But after repeated phone calls to the cottage went unanswered, Mr. Walsh grew uneasy. He walked to Church Lane himself and knocked on the Higgins front door. No answer. Peering through the windows, he saw everything in its usual place. Neat, undisturbed, but lifeless. There were no dishes in the sink, no movement, no sign of breakfast or a rushed departure. The house didn't feel abandoned. It felt evacuated, as though the occupants had simply ceased. Mr. Walsh contacted Sergeant Robert Henley, who arrived within 30 minutes to begin an official investigation. What Sergeant Henley would uncover that day and in the days that followed would not only baffle local authorities, it would tear open the past and force the village of Ashworth to confront truths it had buried for generations. The door to the Higgins cottage was unlocked. In a village like Ashworth, that wasn't entirely unusual. Trust ran deep here. Residents often left their doors unlatched, a quiet affirmation of the safety they believed their community provided. But in the context of the Higgins family's disappearance, it immediately struck Sergeant Henley as ominous. The interior of the cottage was undisturbed, immaculately clean, methodically organized. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, nothing to suggest a hasty exit. It looked like the family had simply stepped out and never returned. Elena's purse still hung neatly on its usual wall hook. Thomas's wallet sat inside the dresser drawer where he always kept it. The children's school uniforms were laid out for Monday morning, ironed and folded with care. In the kitchen, Henley found evidence of a recently shared meal, Sunday dinner by the looks of it. The plates had been washed, dried, and put away. There was no mess, no half-finished food, no utensils left on the table. Everything was in its proper place. Too proper, unnervingly proper. And yet, certain items were missing. Subtle absences that didn't quite fit the scene. Several of Elaena's folklore books had vanished From their usual shelf volumes, neighbors had seen her reading in recent weeks. A bundle of hand-tied herbs, long kept drying near the fireplace, was gone. Most notably, a number of white candles, mentioned by Mrs. Petton in her account, were also missing. But the most troubling find was in Thomas Higgins's small study. On the desk lay an open Bible, its worn pages turned to Revelation, chapter 20. The 1,000 years, the passage describing the final judgment and the binding of Satan. 2 notes were scrawled in the margins, one written in a graceful looping hand, presumed to be Elaena's reed. The old covenant must be honored at all costs. Beneath it, in Thomas's sharper, more angular script, God help us all. I fear we have gone too far to turn back. Whatever had taken place inside that cottage, it had not been sudden. It had been building. Sergeant Henley spent the rest of that day interviewing every resident of Ashworth who might have insight into the Higgins family's activities. But the stories he gathered were incomplete fragments, contradictions, evasions. Everyone agreed the family had changed. Everyone agreed something was wrong, but no one would say what. It quickly became clear to Henley that several individuals, particularly those connected to the Historical Preservation Society, were withholding information. When he questioned Reverend Whitmore, the vicar confirmed that Elaena had been involved with the group, but described it as entirely academic. A harmless exploration of local history. However, as Henley pressed for more detail, recent meeting dates, membership lists, minutes, Whitmore's composure began to crack. He grew vague, defensive. He claimed the society's records were private and that sharing them would violate the group's trust. He even suggested that the Higgins family may have spontaneously decided to take a brief holiday. They'll be back in a few days, he said with a strained smile. No need for panic. It was a hollow reassurance. Dr. Edmund Carr, when approached, hid behind medical confidentiality. Though clearly troubled, he refused to share anything of substance about his recent appointments with Thomas, stating only that the man had been under strain. When reminded that a missing persons case could override standard privacy rules, Dr. Carr reluctantly conceded that Thomas had exhibited signs of anxiety related to family dynamics, but he would say no more. It was Mrs. Margaret Thornton, the village librarian, and one of the society's oldest members, who proved the most willing to talk. Her admission, however, only deepened the mystery. Yes, she said the society had been researching ancient religious customs, rites, and observances from the pre-Christian Dales. And yes, some members had perhaps grown overly zealous in reviving certain traditions. When Henley asked which members and what exactly had been revived, she hesitated. Then admitted the group had recently begun practicing seasonal observances ceremonies tied to the ancient calendar of the land. Things not performed in generations. And then came the break in the case. 3 days after the family vanished, Miss Sarah Collins, the village school teacher, approached Henley with a bundle of disturbing material. It was a collection of drawings. Dozens of them, all created by Billy Higgins during the month of October. The drawings Miss Collins handed over were more than just the idle scribbles of a child. They were haunting, obsessive renderings, page after page, filled with robed figures gathered around what appeared to be an underground altar. The symbols etched onto the stone the layout of the chamber, the postures of the participants. All were disturbingly precise, far too intricate for an 8-year-old's imagination. The altar, with its concentric ring of candles and unfamiliar sigils, appeared repeatedly. Some images depicted ceremonies in progress figures with raised hands, smoke rising from unseen sources, and patterns scrolled across the floor like some ancient script. Even the light in the drawings seemed intentional torchlight flickering shadows, a sense of depth and claustrophobia that felt observed, not imagined. It wasn't just Billy. Margaret's recent schoolwork, particularly her essays, were no less troubling. Miss Collins provided several pieces written in the weeks before the disappearance. The topics ranged from the lost wisdom of the ancients to why modern people have forgotten the old ways. Her grammar was flawless, her sentence structure refined. But the content suggested knowledge well beyond her years. She referenced texts not taught in school. She quoted obscure philosophers, invoked seasonal rites with startling fluency, and spoke of sacrifices made in the name of continuity. Miss Collins had originally assumed the girl had simply read ahead. Now she wasn't so sure. Faced with mounting evidence that the Historical Preservation Society was involved in something far more serious than folklore research, Sergeant Henley resolved to conduct a more thorough search of St. Mary's Church. What he discovered would change the course of the investigation and forever alter his understanding of the village he served. During his initial search, Henley had noticed inconsistencies in the architecture of the building walls that seemed overly thick spaces, that didn't align staircases, that ended prematurely. At the time, he'd chalked it up to centuries of repairs and renovations. But with renewed suspicion, he brought measuring tools and carefully compared the interior layout to the building's known footprint. He found voids, pockets of space unaccounted for in the floor plan. And behind the altar, beneath a wall of weathered limestone, he discovered what had been so carefully hidden. A section of stone, seemingly seamless, was in fact removable. The joints had been disguised, the mortar subtly recessed. With effort, Henley pried the stones free, revealing a narrow passage descending into the earth. The air was cold, older than the church itself. The stone steps were worn smooth by centuries of use. At the bottom, he entered a circular chamber, unlike anything he had encountered in 15 years of police work. Roughly 30 feet in diameter, the room was carved directly into the bedrock. The walls covered in symbols, some vaguely Christian, others unmistakably pagan. Pentagrams interwoven with crosses, sigils that pulsed with strange geometry spirals that seemed to draw the eye inward. The floor was made of blackened stone fitted together in an elaborate pattern that radiated from a central altar. The altar itself was massive, obsidian-like, veined with crimson streaks and stained with substances Henley instinctively refused to identify. Around the altar were remnants of recent activity, melted candles, burned herbs, shards of pottery, and circles of salt. The scent of incense hung heavy in the air, mixed with something metallic and sharp like blood and rust. But it was the personal items that turned dread into horror. Elaena's wedding ring rested on the altar's corner. Beside it, Thomas's pocket watch, its cracked face still ticking faintly. Margaret's red school ribbon was pinned to the altar's edge with a bone-handled brooch. Billy's favorite tin soldier arms, bent and paint-worn thin, stood vigil near the candles. None of these had been abandoned. They'd been placed, deliberately offered. Henley's hands trembled as he opened the scattered journals strewn around the chamber. Some were brittle and yellowed, with age their ink faded and spidery. Others were more recent, and among the newer ones he found Elaena's, dozens of entries spanning from her initial involvement in 1964 to her final message on October 30th, 1965. The early pages were filled with wonder and enthusiasm. Notes on seasonal festivals, herbal lore, and village legends. She described the group's meetings in reverent detail, the laughter, the discovery, the thrill of uncovering forgotten truths. But as the months progressed, the tone shifted. Curiosity turned to devotion, devotion into belief, and belief into obsession. She began referring to the group's work not as research, but as restoration. The church above was a facade, she wrote. The real sanctuary was beneath, in the roots of the old faith. She described the great cycle that must be honored, the elder covenant that once bound the people of Ashworth to powers deeper than any modern theology could understand. The final entries were increasingly frantic. She wrote of visions, voices in the candlelight, the presence of those who remember. She claimed they had awoken something in the deep chamber, something that remembered blood and time and silence, something that waited. The last sentence she wrote, dated October 30th, was underlined 3 times. Tomorrow we fulfill the pact. By the spring of 1965, Elaena's journal had become something more than a personal record. It was a liturgy, a testimony, a sacred blueprint. Her entries no longer described the Historical Preservation Society as a group of scholars or local enthusiasts. It had become in her eyes a congregation, a spiritual vanguard, and their mission had evolved from academic curiosity into what she now called the practical restoration of ancestral wisdom. They no longer merely studied rituals. They performed them. Their belief was clear. Modern Christianity, for all its structure and dogma, had diluted the deeper, older truths. Spiritual traditions that once protected entire communities had been scrubbed clean by centuries of ecclesiastical editing. The society saw itself not as rebels, but as restorers, guardians of a nearly extinguished flame. And Elaena, once merely fascinated by folklore, now viewed herself as chosen. She described their ceremonies in glowing, reverent detail. What had begun as modest, seasonal observances, blessings for the harvest rites of midsummer, the solstice had grown into complex, layered rituals. Many of these rites, she claimed, had once been practiced in the Yorkshire Dales, long before the Roman missionaries arrived with their crucifixes and Latin prayers. But not everything was described with clarity. There were moments in her writing where joy gave way to something more frantic. Lines scratched hastily between paragraphs, references to dreams she didn't want to explain, and brief mentions of the voices, distant at first, then closer. Among the most disturbing entries were those concerning what she called the harvest ceremony. It was central to their restoration effort. According to Elaena's research, or perhaps revelation, this ritual was a keystone act essential to maintaining the spiritual protections over Ashworth. It could not be performed alone, she wrote. It required the full presence of a family unit, a circle unbroken by death or disunity, and it could only be completed on specific nights, times when, as she described it, the veil is so thin it breathes. Her final entries were consumed with the idea that her family had been chosen. She cited omens, symbols, and voices, signs upon the hill, in the fog, in my daughter's sleep. Her tone became exultant, manic, and untethered from reason. She spoke of old promises of returning cycles, and of those who remember what was given. The last pages read less like a diary and more like a devotional. We are the hinge upon which the door must swing. The time has come. The harvest must be gathered, but it was the second journal discovered hidden beneath loose stones in the chamber floor that shifted everything Sergeant Henley believed about the case. Bound in dry, cracked leather, its pages brittle with age, the book appeared far older than Elaena's. It had no title. But the ink within it told stories older and darker than anything she had ever written. The handwriting belonged to many authors, dozens perhaps more writing over the course of nearly half a century. The earliest entries were dated 1922. They bore the precise, elegant penmanship of Father Michael Blackwood, Reverend Whitmore's predecessor, and the man who had served St. Mary's from 1919 until his mysterious death in 1942. Blackwood had, according to church records, been a well-regarded clergyman with an interest in archaeology and local folklore. But what Henley read in the journal revealed a much deeper obsession, one that had festered in secret and taken root beneath Ashworth before most of its current residents were even born. Blackwood's early entries echoed a familiar pattern fascination with the church's unusual architecture, the strange symbology carved into the older stones, and eventually the discovery of the chamber beneath the altar during routine renovations in 1923. At first, he documented his findings with academic detachment. But slowly, page by page, his language shifted from description to interpretation, from observation to invocation. By the mid-1920s, Blackwood wrote that he had begun receiving communications during his time in the chamber visions. During meditation, voices carried in the stillness. He believed the chamber was a conduit, a sacred threshold. The messages, he claimed, came from beyond, offering guidance on rituals that would ensure prosperity, protect Ashworth from plague, misfortune, and forgetfulness. And the rituals grew. What had begun with symbolic acts became corporeal. Blackwood detailed ceremonies that required specific people participants, chosen not by faith, but by lineage. Certain bloodlines, he wrote, had carried the old responsibility, and those lines, he claimed, could be traced. He named them the Thorntons, the Carrs, the Weatherbys, and others. Families who still lived in Ashworth. Families who would later appear in Reverend Whitmore's society. Blackwood's journal revealed how he had slowly drawn these families into his circle. He flattered them, spoke of destiny and duty. He called their cooperation a sacred inheritance, reminding them that their ancestors had once been the village's wardens of balance. And most chillingly, he spoke of the offering, an unnamed ritual hinted at in fragments, oblique references to cycles' alignments, and the price that must be paid to keep the old bond whole. By 1930, Father Blackwood was no longer writing as a priest. His entries had become frantic and cultic. He spoke of awakening of shadows that move beneath the moors and of the return of the covenant. The tone mirrored what Henley had seen in Elaena's final entries, except this began 35 years earlier. The journal ended abruptly in August 1942. The final page was stained, smudged, and difficult to read. But one line was unmistakable, written in a trembling hand. "I have gone too far. The door has opened, and I fear what walks in our blood." The most chilling passages in Father Blackwood's journal dealt with what he called the ultimate sacrifice ceremonies he claimed were essential for preserving the community's spiritual balance, but which in plain terms amounted to the ritualized murder of entire families. The first such account appeared under the date October 1930. The victims were the Morrison family new arrivals to Ashworth from Scotland. Blackwood described the event not with horror or hesitation, but with a cold clerical detachment, as though he were cataloguing a liturgical rite rather than chronicling human slaughter. His tone was devoid of remorse. It was simply required. Sergeant Henley, poring over decades of entries, gradually uncovered a pattern, one that extended far beyond what he had feared. Every few years, beginning in 1930, a new family would be selected for what Blackwood euphemistically referred to as spiritual elevation. These families, always socially marginal or newly arrived, were chosen specifically because their absence could be explained away with minimal disruption. No close ties, no inquiries that might reach beyond Ashworth's fog-shrouded borders. The Morrison family in 1930 was followed by the Hartwells in 1933, the Spencers in 1936, and the Dunbars in 1939. In each case, the disappearance was orchestrated with meticulous care. The family's belongings would be quietly distributed or sold, their homes cleaned and leased to new tenants. Inquiries from neighbors were met with carefully rehearsed stories. Immigration, inheritance, a sudden opportunity elsewhere. No one asked twice. Not in Ashworth, Father Blackwood's own death in 1942, officially listed as natural causes, though the final pages of his journal suggested otherwise briefly disrupted the cycle. But the arrival of Reverend Harold Whitmore in 1943 signaled the beginning of something far more dangerous. Whitmore's own journal entries began appearing in the communal record by 1945. At first, his writings betrayed horror and disbelief at what he had uncovered in the chamber beneath St. Mary's. He described the rituals as barbaric profane. He claimed to pray daily for guidance on how to cleanse the parish of its secret stain, but slowly the tone changed. In careful, measured reflections, Whitmore began to reinterpret Blackwood's legacy. He wrote of spiritual visitations, visions in the darkened chamber, whispers that rose from the stones themselves. He came to believe that his predecessor had not been a madman, but a prophet. He saw patterns in nature crops that failed in years without sacrifice, accidents that followed long gaps between rituals. He convinced himself, piece by piece, that Blackwood's atrocities had protected Ashworth from even worse fates. By 1947, the vicar's conscience had fully surrendered to belief. That year, the Fletchers vanished. Whitmore documented the event in forensic detail. But unlike Blackwood, who had approached the rituals with stern fatalism, Whitmore introduced refinement, method, strategy. He began using psychological tools, guilt, isolation, and flattery to manipulate his chosen victims into participating willingly, or at least with resignation. His brilliance lay not just in maintaining the secrecy of the society, but in ensuring that many of his victims believed they were fulfilling a sacred obligation. Under Whitmore's leadership, the list of disappearances grew. The Ashfords in 1950, the Kellys in 1953, the Bradfords in 1956, the Hawkins in 1959, the Pattersons in 1962. Each vanishing was preceded by a period of careful conditioning. The targeted family would be brought into the Historical Preservation Society under the guise of historical interest. The group's early activities were entirely benign: lectures, manuscript study, folk traditions, and harmless seasonal gatherings. Authentic research into Yorkshire folklore lent the society an academic legitimacy that even the most skeptical newcomers found reassuring. But all the while, Whitmore observed, assessed. He watched for vulnerability, emotional isolation, a hunger for meaning, a readiness to believe in something greater than oneself. He preyed on the intellectually curious and the spiritually restless. Over time, his chosen families were drawn deeper into the group's inner rituals, those that blurred the line between reenactment and invocation, symbolism and sacrifice. By the time the final ceremony approached, the victims had been so thoroughly enveloped in doctrine secrecy and manipulated awe that escape no longer seemed possible. Some, like Thomas Higgins, sensed too late that something was wrong. Others, like Elaena, embraced it completely. They believed they were serving something ancient, something vital, something that required blood. And in return, Ashworth endured quiet, prosperous, untouched by modern ills. For those who remained, the price was simply never spoken of. The transition from scholarly inquiry to active ritual participation was neither abrupt nor obvious. Reverend Whitmore managed it with the precision of a surgeon introducing increasingly esoteric ideas under the guise of historical authenticity and spiritual enrichment. Doubt was tolerated briefly, but only as a test. Those who questioned too much were quietly excluded. Their invitations to future gatherings rescinded with vague justifications. In contrast, those who accepted the arcane teachings with enthusiasm were ushered deeper into the society's inner workings. The chamber beneath St. Mary's played a pivotal role in this transformation. Whitmore understood the space's potential not merely as a symbolic location, but as a psychological instrument. The acoustics distorted sound in disorienting ways, while the dim lighting and unnatural coldness induced a trance-like vulnerability. No drugs were necessary at first. The environment itself worked on the mind, softening critical thinking and heightening emotional suggestibility. But Whitmore's true genius lay in what he called spiritual preparation. Fasting, prolonged silence, isolation, all cloaked in the language of purification. These disciplines were not intended to elevate the spirit, but to dismantle resistance, to exhaust the psyche, and foster dependence on the group. By the time a family was chosen for the harvest ceremony, they were no longer capable of independent thought. They believed with a terrible sincerity that their sacrifice would secure the community's continued peace. Elaena Higgins's journal chronicled this psychological descent in harrowing detail. Over 18 months, she had been methodically shaped. Her intellectual curiosity flattered her yearning for purpose, exploited her sense of self-worth, bound up in the illusion of being chosen. By October 1965, she was not merely compliant, she was zealous. She urged Thomas and the children to embrace what she called the sacred path and expressed profound gratitude for the honor of her family's elevation. Her final entry, dated October 30th, radiated euphoric submission. She wrote of visions, signs, and dreams that confirmed her role in the ritual. She worried only for Thomas, whose heart, she admitted, still clung to doubt. But she reassured herself and the page that Reverend Whitmore had promised his resistance would not last. Whitmore's own account of October 31st was meticulous, detached, and terrifying. The ceremony had been orchestrated with military precision. At 11 p.m., the Higgins family descended once more into the chamber beneath St. Mary's, this time for the final time. They were joined by 6 other society members: Dr. Edmund Carr, Mrs. Margaret Thornton, Mrs. Dorothy Weatherbear, Mr. James Crawford, and 2 others whose names Sergeant Henley recognized as long-standing pillars of the village. The early stages of the ritual were familiar chanting candlelight incense and offerings of herbs elements used in previous ceremonies. But this familiarity was part of the deception. Wine, laced with psychoactive substances, was distributed under the guise of a sacramental toast. Whitmore referred to them euphemistically in his notes as spiritual aids. In truth, they were designed to erode the last defenses of those who might resist. Thomas did resist. As the ceremony's true purpose became clear, he attempted to flee with his children, but the others were ready. The doors had been sealed. The society had rehearsed this possibility. Thomas's pleas were ignored, his strength overwhelmed. The children, disoriented by the drugged wine and the surreal horror of their surroundings, were unable to process what was happening, let alone escape it. Whitmore's description of the killings was clinical and unrepentant. The Higgins family had been sacrificed using methods derived from ancient practice, a cold phrase meant to mask what was in reality calculated brutal murder. Their bodies were then disposed of in a system of caves extending beneath the church and beyond the village caves that had long served this sinister purpose. The society's cover-up was just as thorough as the crime. Dr. Carr fabricated medical records to suggest the family had been struck by a rare contagious illness requiring immediate and discreet removal from the village. The story was circulated quietly. Most villagers, already accustomed to the unspoken rules of Ashworth, accepted the explanation without protest. For those who asked more probing questions, answers were vague but sufficient. In time, the silence would settle. The garden gate would be latched. The windows of the Higgins cottage would remain dark. And life in Ashworth would continue untouched by scandal, just as it always had. But now, with the hidden journals exposed and the evidence laid bare, the truth could no longer be buried. Henley had uncovered not a disappearance, but a legacy of ritual murder. A secret community bound by blood belief and the unbearable weight of tradition. Mrs. Thornton had been the source of a carefully constructed rumor that Thomas Higgins had received a sudden job offer in another county, one so urgent it required immediate relocation. It was a lie designed to explain away the family's abrupt disappearance. Meanwhile, the Higgins' personal effects were quietly dismantled. Valuables were claimed by members of the Historical Preservation Society, while mundane items were either destroyed or buried. Within a week, the house had been scrubbed clean-purged of anything that might raise questions. By the time a new family moved into the cottage, believing the previous tenants had immigrated to Canada, Ashworth had already buried its latest secret. Sergeant Henley quickly realized his investigation was being deliberately obstructed. Villagers answered his questions with half-truths and misleading stories. When he asked directly about the Historical Preservation Society, they described it as an innocuous academic circle, a group of harmless antiquarians preserving bits of local lore. But beneath that thin veneer, Henley could feel the coordinated silence. Many knew more than they claimed. Some lied outright. Others simply refused to speak at all. The conspiracy, it turned out, extended far beyond the perpetrators. Dozens of townspeople had at the very least suspected the truth. Some had noted the strange pattern of disappearances stretching back decades. But fear and social pressure had kept them quiet. No one wanted to believe their neighbors capable of such evil. And those who did believe had decided it was safer to look away. Just as it seemed the full extent of the horror had been uncovered, Henley's investigation revealed something worse. This was not simply a case of individual madness or small-scale cult activity. It was a community-wide complicity, a system that had protected and perpetuated murder for over half a century. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit like to support our content and subscribe for more stories that pull back the veil on the unknown. But stay with us as Sergeant Henley prepares to confront the living guardians of Ashworth's secrets. The truth may yet take one more horrific turn. Armed with the journals, the ritual chamber evidence, and personal items belonging to the victims, Henley began the arduous task of dismantling the conspiracy. He soon identified 12 individuals with direct involvement in the murders, and many more whose silence had helped shield the perpetrators. The first arrest was Dr. Edmund Carr. His medical records, handwritten notes, and presence in the underground chamber left little doubt of his role. At first, Carr insisted the journals were fabrications, delusions crafted by disturbed minds. But as more evidence surfaced, and as other witnesses began to talk, his resistance collapsed. Carr's confession proved crucial. It revealed how deeply the participants had immersed themselves in self-deception. According to him, the group never believed they were committing murder. They convinced themselves they were guiding chosen souls through a sacred transformation, one that transcended mortal life. This theological delusion, he admitted, had been necessary to prevent guilt or rebellion. It made them feel like priests, not killers. Mrs. Margaret Thornton, on the other hand, withstood questioning for several days. She maintained a polished academic air, insisting the Historical Preservation Society was nothing more than a research collective. But when Henley discovered a hidden compartment in her home containing artifacts from several of the vanished families, ribbons, rings, toys, her narrative collapsed. Her confession painted an even darker picture. The killings hadn't just served spiritual ends, they had become woven into the village's very structure. The possessions of murdered families weren't discarded, they were claimed, redistributed among the society like trophies. Some were sold, others were displayed as heirlooms. The dead were not just sacrificed, they were stripped, consumed by a town that fed on its own history. And now, the reckoning had begun. The victims' cottages had not been abandoned. They had been repurposed. Rented or sold discreetly, the properties provided ongoing income that funded the Historical Preservation Society's increasingly secretive activities. More chillingly, the disappearances served as a convenient method for removing families whose presence had become inconvenient newcomer skeptics or those who refused to blend into Ashworth's carefully curated facade of harmony. Beneath the surface of tradition and community, a ruthless system had operated for decades. The arrest of Reverend Whitmore was the most dramatic and damning moment of the investigation. When Sergeant Henley arrived at the rectory with a warrant, he found the vicar barricaded in his study, surrounded by piles of papers and scorched fragments, evidence he had been feverishly attempting to destroy. Whitmore had clearly anticipated this moment. For days, he had been dismantling the written record of his crimes, but not quickly enough. The man Henley arrested bore little resemblance to the composed, persuasive leader of the Historical Preservation Society. The journal entries had foreshadowed his unravelling paranoia. Grandiosity and apocalyptic rhetoric had begun dominating his writings after the Higgins murders. Now face to face with the law, Whitmore was incoherent. His statements were disjointed sermons, peppered with obscure scripture pleas to the old ones, and proclamations of divine necessity. It was clear his mind had fractured under the weight of his own delusions. The trial that followed, held at York Crown Court in the spring of 1966, would shock a nation. Newspaper headlines labeled it "The Cult Beneath the Church." Reporters, jurists, and psychologists all struggled to comprehend the true horror of what had unfolded in Ashworth, a conspiracy so vast, so intimate, and so coldly efficient that it seemed almost impossible to believe. The prosecution built its case on the handwritten journals recovered from the underground chamber forensic evidence, from the ritual site and cave network, and testimony from villagers who, after decades of silence, finally spoke. Witness after witness described a community where suspicion had festered but never taken form, where polite silence had become a mechanism of complicity. Dr. Carr's confession was the linchpin. His testimony laid bare the slow, methodical, psychological grooming that had defined both Father Blackwood's and Reverend Whitmore's approach. Through a mix of spiritual seduction and cognitive dissonance, rational adults had been led step by step into participating in and justifying murder. Many, Carr explained, genuinely believed they were saving souls, but the trial didn't just expose spiritual delusion. It revealed a web of economic motives that had helped sustain the killings. The victims, it turned out, were often property owners. After their disappearance, homes, land, and valuables were quietly absorbed by members of the society. Some cases involved fraudulent wills. Others were simpler, a vacated cottage cleaned and leased within weeks. Inheritance laws were exploited as coldly as any ritual. Margaret Thornton's testimony cast further light on the social machinery that had kept everything in motion. Dissenters, anyone who asked too many questions, were gradually cut off. Invitations to community events would stop arriving. Business would dry up. Rumors would spread. The price of suspicion was isolation. Over time, even the most inquisitive villagers learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. Reverend Whitmore posed the most difficult challenge for the court. Though his crimes were numerous and meticulously documented, his sanity was in question. Court-appointed psychiatrists diagnosed him with severe delusional disorders, likely festering for years. And yet the prosecution argued convincingly that his madness had never impaired his intent. He had planned the murders with extraordinary precision. His actions were not those of a man lost in chaos, but of one who had created his own orderly nightmare and demanded others join it. As the proceedings continued, the horrifying scale of the Ashworth murders came into view. Forensic teams combing the vast natural cave system beneath St. Mary's Church made grim discoveries. The remains of 17 families, 63 individuals, were recovered buried in stages across nearly 4 decades. The victims ranged from infants to the elderly. Many of them were entire bloodlines, wiped out, as if to erase them from history altogether. The methods of murder varied. Some were strangled, others drugged. A few bore signs of more archaic forms of violence: knives, blunt instruments, burns. The choice of method seemed to evolve with the leadership's rituals and theological whims. What remained constant was the intention, the complete erasure of a chosen family carried out in secret and in the name of divine necessity. Father Blackwood had relied on ritualistic techniques he insisted were rooted in ancient sacrificial rites, grim archaic procedures cloaked in the language of tradition. Reverend Whitmore, by contrast, had developed methods that were colder, more efficient. His refinements minimized the risk of discovery and streamlined the disposal of remains. Forensic evidence confirmed the use of powerful sedatives drugs designed to dull resistance and render victims compliant before the final act. But no chemical could fully erase fear. The condition of the children's remains was especially harrowing. Signs of prolonged terror, tightened jawbones, stress fractures, defensive wounds suggested that many of them were fully aware of their fate before they died. Their last moments had not been peaceful. As the investigation widened, its scope expanded far beyond the sleepy boundaries of Ashworth. Reports emerged from surrounding Yorkshire villages. Cases previously dismissed as isolated disappearances now echoed the patterns found in Ashworth. Families vanished with eerie similarity. Abrupt departures, no forwarding address, whispered rumors of spiritual awakenings. The evidence pointed to a chilling possibility that Ashworth had not acted alone, but as part of a broader network. Other groups, perhaps under similar cloaks of historical or religious research, might have been orchestrating atrocities of their own. The fallout from the Ashworth revelations would haunt the region for decades. For those who had lived in the village during the years the crimes were committed, the psychological cost was devastating. Court testimony had pulled back the veil on a community riddled with fear, complicity, and deliberate self-deception. Some villagers had known more than they had ever admitted even to themselves. Others had seen things they hadn't understood. Strange ceremonies, absences, the slow fading of families, and had said nothing. After the trials, many struggled with unbearable guilt. What should I have done differently? What did I ignore? Even those with no direct involvement questioned their silence, their trust, and their complicity in the lies. For the younger generation, the damage was worse still. Children who had grown up under the warm smiles of village elders now learned that some of those same adults had participated in ritual murder. The betrayal was profound. Many required years of therapy to process the horror. They found themselves unable to form trusting relationships. Some became reclusive. Others developed long-term symptoms of trauma, what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares became common. So did anxiety attacks. For many, the peaceful cottages and country lanes of Ashworth no longer felt like home, but like camouflage for unspeakable acts. Familiar places, the church pews, the rectory gates, even the village green, were transformed into psychic minefields, littered with memories they couldn't suppress. But the Ashworth case revealed more than the darkness of human belief. It exposed institutional failure at every level. Over the decades, authorities had received reports and letters, whispers, informal complaints regarding disappearances and strange behavior in Ashworth. Yet these warnings were overlooked, dismissed as eccentricity or coincidence. Investigations were cursory cases closed quickly. The unspoken assumption was that rural people often left without warning, seeking work or escape, especially in times of economic hardship. This reasoning, combined with the high social standing of the perpetrators, had allowed the conspiracy to operate in plain sight. The Church of England, too, bore responsibility. The Ashworth investigation highlighted glaring gaps in the oversight of rural parishes. Clergy like Blackwood and Whitmore had been granted near total autonomy. The church hierarchy, distant and deferential, failed to question their practices. That failure had tragic consequences. In the aftermath, the church enacted sweeping reforms, stricter background checks for clergy, mandatory reporting procedures, and independent audits for small parishes, measures that might have stopped Ashworth before it claimed 63 lives. Local law enforcement underwent a reckoning of its own. The Ashworth case prompted a national review of missing persons protocols. A new emphasis was placed on pattern recognition and interagency communication tools that could have connected the dots years earlier. Police across Yorkshire received updated training in identifying organized criminal behavior, particularly when masked by social or religious institutions. Ashworth had been a quiet village, a place people moved to, not from. But beneath its stone cottages and hedgerows, a monstrous lie had grown, cultivated by authority, protected by silence, and fertilized by fear. When the truth finally emerged, it changed not only Ashworth, but the very systems meant to prevent such evil. The medical and social service systems had failed the people of Ashworth as thoroughly as the church and police. Nowhere was this failure more evident than in the dual role played by Dr. Carr. As both the trusted community physician and a key member of the murderous conspiracy, he had been uniquely positioned to falsify records, obscure warning signs, and support the cover stories that allowed entire families to vanish without question. This betrayal prompted sweeping reforms in medical oversight across the UK. New regulations required independent medical verification for all cases involving sudden family relocations, ambiguous illnesses, or unexplained absences, especially when children were involved. The legal reckoning came in the autumn of 1966. The trials of the Ashworth conspirators concluded with convictions for all those deemed mentally competent to stand trial. Reverend Whitmore, found guilty but legally insane, was sentenced to indefinite confinement in a secure psychiatric hospital. He would spend the remainder of his life in isolation, tormented by the delusions that had once inspired reverence and fear. Dr. Carr, Mrs. Thornton, and 4 others received life sentences for their direct roles in the murders. Several additional villagers were given shorter prison terms for aiding the cover-ups and for their willful silence in the face of overwhelming signs of abuse. In rendering judgment, the court acknowledged the psychological pressure and social coercion many had endured. But it also affirmed a hard truth: every adult bears an unshakable moral responsibility to protect the vulnerable no matter the cost. The sentences proved deeply divisive. Some critics believed they were too lenient given the grotesque scale and brutality of the crimes. Others argued they were too harsh, pointing to the years of psychological grooming and manipulation many defendants had suffered. The presiding judge, however, was unequivocal. In his closing remarks, he emphasized that a civilized society cannot function if moral accountability is surrendered to fair tradition or blind loyalty to authority. The financial assets of the convicted were seized and used to fund compensation for surviving relatives. But this, too, proved tragically limited. Many of the murdered families had been selected precisely because they lacked external ties, no relatives to grieve them, no legal heirs to receive justice. Their erasure had been deliberate and methodical. The revelation of the conspiracy's full scope destroyed Ashworth in every sense but the literal. The village, once a place of warmth, heritage, and quiet pride, became a symbol of horror. Even those who had not been directly involved could not bear the shame of remaining. Residents began to leave in waves. Businesses shuttered. Property values collapsed. Streets, once filled with the voices of children, fell silent. St. Mary's Church, the spiritual and physical heart of the village, was deconsecrated by the Church of England. Officials deemed it too corrupted to preserve, and within a year it was demolished. The underground chamber beneath it, where rituals had been performed and lives extinguished, was flooded with concrete and buried beneath grass and soil. Yet the land could not forget. Even covered, even sealed, it retained the oppressive weight of memory. The cottages that had once housed the murdered families became pariahs, structures that no amount of renovation could cleanse. The Higgins cottage, where the unravelling had begun, stood empty for years, its windows dark, its doors warped by time and weather. It was finally demolished in the early 1970s, more out of necessity than desire. No one would buy it. No one could live there. Ashworth's school closed when enrollment dwindled to unsustainable levels. The post office, once run with quiet dignity by Thomas Higgins, was shuttered. By 1970, fewer than 50 souls remained in what had once been a thriving village of 300. What was left of Ashworth became a cautionary tale one whispered in criminal justice classrooms, theological seminars, and hushed family dinners. It stood as a brutal reminder of what can happen when the institutions meant to guide and protect instead conspire to destroy. The few who remained in Ashworth after the trials were mostly elderly residents with nowhere else to go, or younger individuals who had inherited property that could neither be sold nor emotionally abandoned. What persisted was not a community but a shell haunted by silence, suspicion, and decay. The vibrant village that had once been celebrated for its charm and neighborly spirit had become something unrecognizable. Without the tax base or communal will to maintain infrastructure, the roads cracked and eroded, weeds overtook once pristine gardens, and once cheerful cottages sagged under the weight of years of neglect. Public spaces once alive with children's laughter and summer fetes became overgrown ruins. Ashworth had transformed into a ghost village, an open wound on the English countryside where time stood still, and the past lingered like a fog. But the story did not end at Ashworth's crumbling boundaries. The case became a landmark in the study of group psychology, religious extremism, and institutional complicity. Criminologists, sociologists, and historians dissected every detail seeking to understand how systematic murder could hide in plain sight within a peaceful democratic society. The Ashworth conspiracy challenged the comforting belief that atrocities only occur under authoritarian regimes or during war. It exposed a darker truth that under the right conditions, secrecy, hierarchy, tradition, evil can wear the face of respectability. Faith communities across the UK and beyond were shaken by the religious dimensions of the crimes. The fact that ordained clergy had orchestrated mass murder under the guise of spiritual duty forced churches to re-evaluate how power and trust were allocated. The need for accountability, transparency, and external oversight became impossible to ignore. Psychologists took special note of how Whitmore and his predecessors had used classic manipulation techniques: gaslighting, isolation, ritualized repetition, social pressure to break down critical thinking, and mold ordinary people into compliant accomplices. These findings would go on to influence research into cult behavior radicalization and domestic extremism for decades. And the broader lesson: it was chilling in its simplicity. Horror doesn't always arrive with a scream or a warning. Sometimes it creeps in with a smile, dressed in tradition, bearing candles and hymns. The Higgins family, like so many before them, believed in the fundamental goodness of their community. They trusted their church, their neighbors, and the quiet rhythms of village life. They never imagined that beneath the calm exterior, a vast and long-running network of deception and ritual murder had taken root. That is perhaps the most terrifying revelation of all, that good people, decent people, can be slowly led into darkness by forces they don't recognize until it's too late. That entire communities can be conditioned to look away, to stay silent, to rationalize the unthinkable in the name of unity or higher purpose. The Ashworth case remains a stark warning, a warning about the seductive power of groupthink, about the dangers of isolating ourselves from outside scrutiny, about the ease with which those in positions of power can cloak their crimes in language that sounds noble, sacred, or traditional. And it reminds us, most of all, that monsters are rarely obvious. Often, they sit beside us at community meetings. They bless our children. They quote scripture. They smile. If you found this story as chilling and thought-provoking as we did, share it with someone who loves true crime with depth and meaning. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss another journey into the dark corners of human behavior. And tell us in the comments below, could something like this happen again? Have you ever witnessed the subtle ways communities protect secrets they don't want to face? Because the truth is, our greatest defense isn't strength or knowledge or even faith. It's the courage to ask uncomfortable questions and the willingness to see what lies behind the curtain. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and stay skeptical.